My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 32 years old, and I'll never forget the sting of that company dinner. It was supposed to be a celebration, our annual awards night, full of forced smiles and corporate backpatting. But for me, it became the night I was publicly dismissed as a nobody, the night they tried to make me believe I was nothing. Only moments before the most unexpected, most deliciously ironic validation of my entire career. They thought they had me pinned, that I was just a ghost in their machine, easily overlooked and quickly forgotten. They had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them, or more accurately, who was about to be called director by the one person whose opinion mattered more than all of theirs combined. The ballroom was opulent, exactly the kind of place Sterling and Finch Investments like to show off. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears. The clinking of champagne flutes, a constant, almost mocking soundtrack to the low murmur of expensive suits and carefully curated conversations. Our CEO, Mr. Henderson, a man whose booming voice and equally inflated ego dominated every room, was holding court at the head table. And then there was Mark Jenkins, my direct supervisor, the company's golden boy, who had a talent for presenting my meticulously researched proposals as his own brilliant insights. I was, as usual, relegated to a table near the back, tucked away by the service entrance, a seating arrangement that seemed to perfectly reflect my perceived importance in their grand, glittering world. The speeches droned on, an endless parade of self-congratulation and thinly veiled boasts. I was just trying to breathe, to make it through the evening with my composure intact, to plaster on a smile that felt like cracking porcelain and pretend that the daily grind of casual dismissals, stolen credit, and the gnawing feeling of being perpetually undervalued didn't chip away at my soul. Then, during a lull, as dessert was being cleared, Mr. Henderson, clearly feeling magnanimous and perhaps prompted by a sly, smirking nod from Mark, decided he needed a little amusement. His gaze, cold and dismissive, swept the room and landed squarely on me. "And then, of course, we have Sarah," he announced, his voice carrying easily, a condescending drawl lacing his tone that made my stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. Always diligently working hard in wherever it is she works from. A ripple of polite, sycophantic laughter went through the tables closest to him. My face began to burn, a humiliating heat spreading up my neck. Before I could even think of a response, or whether one was even permissible, Mark chimed in, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "Oh, Sarah's great. A real asset when it comes to, she makes a fantastic cup of coffee, right, Henderson?" More laughter, louder this time, more openly derisive. They said I was nothing. Not in those exact words, perhaps, but the message was as clear as the crystal glasses on their tables. I was a punchline. Invisible when it mattered, and a target for cheap shots when they needed one. In that moment, under the collective gaze of what felt like 100 pairs of judging eyes, I felt smaller, more insignificant than I ever had in my entire life. I wanted the plush, patterned carpet to open up and swallow me whole. The air felt thick, unbreathable. Little did they know, and little did I even dare to fully hope in that precise, agonizing second, that the universe, or perhaps just a very, very important client with impeccable timing, had a dramatically different title in mind for me. A title that would wipe the smirks right off their faces. Have you ever been made to feel completely invisible or utterly worthless at your job, especially when you know you're giving it your absolute all, pouring your heart and soul into your work only to be dismissed or ridiculed? Share your story in the comments below. Let's show each other that we're not alone in these fights and that our worth is not defined by those who refuse to see it. And please, don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear exactly how this disastrous night took a turn that no one, least of all Mr. Henderson and Mark, could have ever, in their wildest dreams, predicted. That night at the dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was merely the festering public culmination of years of quiet erosion. My journey at Sterling and Finch Investments had started with such high hopes. I'd graduated top of my class, full of ambition and a genuine passion for financial strategy. I thought I'd found a place where my skills would be valued, where hard work translated directly into recognition. How naive I was. The reality of the corporate culture, especially under Mr. Henderson's reign, was a slow, suffocating disillusionment. It was a boys' club, through and through, and Mark Jenkins was its poster child. Mark. Even now, saying his name leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. He had this uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time, usually hovering near my desk just as I was finalizing a complex analysis or putting the finishing touches on a groundbreaking proposal. He'd ask a few superficial questions, nod thoughtfully, and then, like magic, my ideas would reappear a week later in a board meeting, presented with charismatic flair from his lips, often with minor, almost insulting tweaks that he'd claim were his strategic enhancements. The first time it happened, I was stunned into silence. I'd developed a new risk assessment model for emerging markets, something I'd poured months of late nights and weekends into. I'd shared a draft with Mark, seeking his senior input, as he'd suggested. The following Monday, Mr. Henderson was lauding Mark for his innovative approach to risk management. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. I felt a hot wave of disbelief, then a cold dread. When I tentatively tried to address it with Mark, he just smiled, that infuriatingly charming smile, and said, "Team effort, Sarah. Team effort. Glad my guidance helped you get there." He made it sound like he had mentored me into my own idea. Mr. Henderson, of course, lapped it up. He saw in Mark a younger version of himself, confident, assertive, and frankly, excellent at taking credit. My quiet, meticulous work ethic was apparently invisible to him. Or worse, it was perceived as a lack of ambition, a sign that I was content to stay in the background. Meetings were a particular nightmare. I'd present data, carefully compiled, and Henderson would either stare out the window or interrupt me to ask Mark for his take. If I dared to challenge a flawed strategy, especially one championed by Mark or another of Henderson's favorites, I'd be met with condescending explanations, as if I were a child who couldn't grasp complex concepts. "Sarah, with all due respect," Henderson would boom, "perhaps you're not seeing the bigger picture here. Mark has a knack for these things." The "with all due respect" was always a prelude to maximum disrespect. I remember one specific instance, the pitch for the lucrative Northwood account. I'd done almost all the groundwork, market analysis, competitor research, the financial modeling that proved we could offer them a significantly better return. Mark was supposed to co-present with me. The night before, he called me, saying he had a family emergency and couldn't make it. He asked me to email him my final slides, just so he was in the loop. The next day, I walked into the client meeting to find Mark already there, schmoozing with the Northwood executives, my slides loaded on the projector under his name. He'd apparently had a miraculous recovery. He delivered my presentation, almost verbatim, and basked in the applause. When the Northwood CEO asked a particularly technical question about the modeling, Mark faltered, looking like a deer in headlights, and actually had the audacity to say, "Let me just consult my notes." Or perhaps Sarah, who assisted with some of the initial data gathering, might have a quick look. The implication was clear. I was the glorified research assistant. He was the mastermind. I answered the question crisply and accurately, saving the presentation. But the credit and the subsequent bonus went entirely to Mark. It wasn't just the stolen ideas, it was the constant, subtle undermining. It was being talked over in meetings, my suggestions ignored only to be praised when a male colleague repeated them 5 minutes later. It was the honey and sweetie from older male executives. The assumption that I'd be the one to take notes or fetch coffee, even when I was the most qualified person in the room on the actual subject matter. It was the exclusion from the after-work drinks at the Gentlemen's Club, where Henderson apparently made most of his key decisions. Each instance was a small cut, but collectively they bled me dry of confidence. I started to doubt myself, to wonder if maybe they were right, if maybe I wasn't cut out for this high-powered world. The injustice of it all was a constant, heavy weight on my chest, a knot of frustration and anger that I had to swallow down every single day just to survive. The environment was designed to make women like me feel small, to make us question our own worth, to ensure we never got too ambitious or rocked the boat. The favoritism towards Mark was blatant, a daily reminder that competence and hard work meant little if you weren't part of Henderson's inner circle, a circle I was clearly never going to be invited into, and they thought I didn't notice. They thought I'd just quietly accept my place. They were so wrong. Amidst the daily onslaught of dismissals and stolen credit, there was one person who seemed to see through the charade, one individual who didn't buy into the Henderson Jenkins Mutual Admiration Society. That person was Mr. Alastair Finch. Yes, the Finch of Sterling and Finch Investments. He was the semi-retired co-founder, a legend in the industry, a man whose name still carried immense weight despite his infrequent appearances at the office. He was old school, certainly, but in a way that valued substance over style, integrity over sycophancy. And for reasons I couldn't quite fathom at first, he'd taken a quiet, almost imperceptible interest in me. Mr. Finch rarely attended the regular, boisterous company meetings. He preferred to wander the floors unannounced, observing, listening. He had an office, more of a study really, tucked away in a quieter part of the building, filled with books and artifacts from his long career, a stark contrast to Henderson's modern, sterile power suite. A few times, he'd stopped by my cubicle, which was then in a rather forgotten corner of the open-plan office, ostensibly to ask for a specific industry report or an old file. But his questions often strayed, delving into my analysis, my methodology, my opinions on market trends. He wouldn't just listen, he would hear me. He'd ask follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely processing what I said, not just waiting for his turn to speak or to dismiss my input. I remember one afternoon, I was wrestling with a particularly complex dataset for a new investment vehicle Mark had been tasked with developing, meaning I was doing all the foundational work. Mark had breezed by earlier, given a few vague, unhelpful directives, and then disappeared for a client lunch. I was hunched over my screen, lost in spreadsheets and projections, when I sensed someone behind me. It was Mr. Finch. He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched. Then very quietly he said, "That's an interesting approach to weighting the emerging tech sector, Ms. Miller. Most analysts are far too conservative there." I almost fell off my chair. Not only had he recognized the nuance of what I was doing, but he'd also addressed me formally, respectfully. Mark usually just called me Sarah, or, if he was feeling particularly condescending, kiddo. Mr. Finch would sometimes invite me for a brief chat in his study. He'd offer me tea, proper tea, in a china cup, not the lukewarm stuff from the break room machine. And we'd talk. Not about office politics, never that. He was far too discreet. But we'd discuss economic theory, global financial shifts, the ethical responsibilities of investment firms. He'd loan me books, articles, sometimes just a cryptic, handwritten note with a single stock symbol on it and a question mark, prompting me to do my own research and form my own conclusions. He saw the spark in me, the intellectual curiosity that Henderson and Mark either couldn't see or chose to ignore. He never overtly praised me in front of them, never intervened directly in the daily injustices, which at the time I sometimes wished he would. But his quiet encouragement, his implicit validation of my intellect and my work was like a lifeline. It was a reminder that I wasn't crazy, that my skills were valuable, even if the dominant voices in the company refused to acknowledge it. He once told me, during one of our tea sessions, "Ms. Miller, in this business, noise often gets mistaken for substance, but true value, the kind that endures, is built on quiet diligence and irrefutable results. Don't let the noise distract you from building your foundation." It was advice that stuck with me, advice that I clung to during the most demoralizing moments. He never explicitly mentioned Henderson or Mark, but the implication was clear. He saw what was happening. He knew. And his subtle support gave me the strength to keep going, to keep working, to keep believing that one day, somehow, the substance would overcome the noise. He was my silent champion, the unexpected ally who, without fanfare, kept a small flame of hope alive within me, a flame that Henderson and Mark were so determined to extinguish. He was the reason I didn't just give up and walk away, which, believe me, I was tempted to do on more occasions than I can count. His belief in me, however understated, was a shield against the constant barrage of negativity. While Henderson and Mark were busy basking in their self-perceived glory, convinced I was just a cog in their machine, diligently making coffee and assisting with data, I was playing a long game. Mr. Finch's words about quiet diligence and irrefutable results became my mantra. I knew I couldn't fight their brand of office politics head-on. I wasn't wired for that kind of overt confrontation, and frankly, they held all the obvious power. So I started to build my own in silence, brick by painstaking brick. My official work, the tasks assigned by Mark, I continued to do flawlessly, even though I knew he'd likely take the credit. It was frustrating, soul-crushingly so at times, but I understood it was a necessary camouflage. While they saw me as the quiet, unassuming Sarah churning out reports, I was using every spare moment, my lunch breaks, my evenings, my weekends, to forge a different path. Mr. Finch had inadvertently opened a door for me, a very important one. He had, on a couple of occasions, mentioned a particularly challenging, high-value client, a reclusive tech billionaire named Julian Vance, whose portfolio was notoriously difficult to manage and who had cycled through several account managers at other firms. Vance was known for his sharp intellect, his impatience with corporate fluff, and his demand for innovative, data-driven strategies. Henderson and Mark had tried to land him, of course, with their usual flashy presentations and empty promises, but Vance had remained elusive, unimpressed. Mr. Finch, knowing my analytical strengths, had subtly suggested I take a look at the Vance Industries file, just for an intellectual exercise, he'd said, with a twinkle in his eye. That intellectual exercise became my secret obsession. I delved into Vance's company, his investment philosophy, his public statements, his philanthropic interests. I analyzed market trends relevant to his holdings with a depth and granularity I knew Mark would never have the patience for. I wasn't just looking at numbers. I was trying to understand the man, his vision, his pain points. I started to develop a bespoke investment strategy for him, one that was bold, unconventional, but meticulously backed by data and a deep understanding of his unique risk appetite. It was a strategy far removed from Sterling and Finch's typically conservative, one-size-fits-all approach. I worked on this in absolute secrecy. I used my personal laptop, encrypted files, and communicated with a few trusted external contacts I'd cultivated over the years. Academics, independent analysts, even a former classmate who now worked in a niche tech sector Vance was reportedly interested in. I was building a case, a comprehensive, undeniable demonstration of value. It was exhausting. There were nights I barely slept, fueled by coffee and a burning sense of purpose, a quiet rage at being so consistently underestimated. I was also taking online courses in advanced financial modeling and behavioral economics, anything that could give me an edge, anything that could make my secret project for Julian Vance absolutely bulletproof. During this time, Mark would occasionally saunter over to my desk, usually when he needed some urgent numbers crunched for one of his presentations. "Sarah, be a star and get me the Q3 projections for the Henderson account, will you? And make them look good," he'd say, without even making eye contact, already turning to leave. I'd just nod, smile faintly, and do the work, all the while thinking about the intricate algorithms I was building for the Vance proposal. The irony was almost delicious. They saw me as a background fixture, while in the shadows I was crafting what I hoped would be my masterpiece. Mr. Finch, in his own way, facilitated this. He never asked directly what I was doing, but he made sure I had access to certain industry databases and research tools that were typically reserved for senior partners. Sometimes, a relevant academic paper or an obscure market report would anonymously appear on my desk, always something that uncannily pertained to the very problem I was trying to solve for the Vance strategy. I knew it was him. He was my silent enabler, my unseen mentor in this covert operation. He was teaching me not just about finance, but about strategy, about patience, about choosing the right moment to reveal your strength. He was helping me build my irrefutable results. The public humiliation, the stolen credit, the casual sexism, it all became fuel. Every dismissive comment from Henderson, every condescending smirk from Mark just made me work harder, dig deeper, refine my secret weapon with even greater precision. They thought they were breaking me down, but in reality, They were forging me into something much stronger, something they wouldn't see coming until it was far too late. If this story of fighting back against a toxic work environment resonates with you, please leave a like to support more content like this. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know what kind of stories you connect with most. So, there I was, at that dreadful company dinner, the laughter of Henderson and Mark echoing in my ears, the taste of ashes in my mouth. "She makes a fantastic cup of coffee, right, Henderson?" Mark's voice, dripping with condescension, still hung in the air. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, some pitying, most amused. I wanted to disappear. I was gripping my water glass so tightly, I was surprised it didn't shatter. My carefully constructed composure was cracking. Just as I was about to mumble some sort of excuse to flee the ballroom, my phone, sitting innocuously on the table beside my untouched dessert, began to vibrate. Not just vibrate, but ring. Loudly. I usually kept it on silent during these events, but in my earlier distress, I must have forgotten. The ringtone, a fairly generic one, cut through the residual chuckles. Heads turned. Henderson frowned, clearly annoyed at the interruption to his entertainment. Mark shot me a glare that said, "How dare you?" My heart hammered against my ribs. I fumbled for the phone, my cheeks burning even hotter than before, intending to silence it immediately. But then I saw the caller ID. Julian Vance. My breath hitched. It couldn't be. Not now. Not like this. My secret project, my meticulously crafted strategy for Vance Industries, was something I'd been working on for nearly a year. I had, with Mr. Finch's discreet encouragement, managed to get a highly condensed version of my proposal to Vance's notoriously impenetrable chief of staff just a week prior. A Hail Mary pass if there ever was one. I hadn't expected to hear anything back for weeks, if ever. "Excuse me," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse, as I stood up, acutely aware of every eye in the room following me. I half ran, half stumbled towards the nearest exit into the relative quiet of the hotel lobby, my hand shaking as I answered, "Hello? Sarah Miller speaking." "Ms. Miller, Julian Vance here." His voice was exactly as I'd imagined from his interviews, deep, direct, no time for pleasantries. "I've reviewed your proposal. It's remarkably insightful. The most intelligent analysis of my portfolio and potential growth sectors I've seen in a decade. Frankly, it's brilliant." I leaned against a marble pillar for support, my knees suddenly weak. Julian Vance thought my work was brilliant. The words echoed in my ears, a stark, beautiful contrast to the dismissive laughter I'd just escaped. "Mr. Vance, thank you, I'm honored," I stammered, trying to regain some semblance of professional calm. "Don't be honored. Be prepared," he said, a hint of dry humor in his tone. "I want to implement this. Yesterday. There are a few key points I'd like to discuss directly with the person who clearly understands my vision. I assume that's you, Ms. Miller, not whichever overpaid suit at Sterling and Finch typically takes credit for the actual work." The directness of his question, the clear implication that he saw through corporate posturing, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. "Yes, Mr. Vance. The strategy, the analysis, it was all my work," I said, a newfound strength creeping into my voice. "Good. I don't suffer fools, and I certainly don't suffer people who try to pass off other people's genius as their own. Now, I understand your firm is having some sort of celebratory dinner tonight. How did he know that? Mr. Finch, perhaps? My apologies for the interruption, but this is time-sensitive. I need to speak with the director in charge of this proposal." "That would be you, correct, Director Miller?" "Director Miller." He called me Director Miller. The words hung in the air, surreal, powerful. A slow smile spread across my face, a genuine smile, the first one in what felt like an eternity. "Yes, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice now clear and confident. "That would be me, Director Sarah Miller. How can I help you?" I spent another 10 minutes on the phone with him, discussing specific action points, next steps, the sheer scale of what he was proposing to entrust to me, to Sterling and Finch, because of me. My mind was racing, but a strange calm had settled over me. When the call ended, I took a deep breath. The humiliation I'd felt just moments before was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. And I had to admit, a delicious anticipation for what was about to happen. I walked back into the ballroom. The atmosphere was still buzzing, though the focus had shifted from my earlier embarrassment. Henderson was now pontificating about some supposed future triumph for the company. Mark was nodding along, looking smug. They didn't even notice my return at first. I walked, not back to my Siberia by the service door, but directly towards the head table. My heels clicked purposefully on the polished floor, the sound cutting through Henderson's monologue. He stopped mid-sentence, annoyance flashing across his face as he saw me approaching. Mark looked up, a sneer already forming on his lips. "Sarah, really, this is hardly the time or place for—" Henderson began, his voice booming with disapproval. I didn't let him finish. I held up my hand, a gesture so uncharacteristically bold for the old Sarah that it momentarily stunned him into silence. "Mr. Henderson, Mark," I said, my voice calm, but carrying a new authority that made several nearby heads turn. "I apologize for the interruption earlier. That was Julian Vance on the phone." A flicker of something, confusion, interest, crossed Henderson's face. Mark just looked bewildered. "Vance? Julian Vance?" Henderson repeated, his tone skeptical. "What would he want?" "He wanted to speak to me," I said, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. "He's reviewed a proposal I developed for Vance Industries. He called it brilliant and remarkably insightful. He wants to implement it immediately." I paused, enjoying the slow dawning of comprehension and then horror on their faces. He also specifically asked to speak with the director in charge of the project. I looked directly at Henderson, then at Mark, whose jaw was now slack. He referred to me as Director Miller. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the plush carpet. Henderson's face went from florid red to a sickly pale. Mark looked like he'd been slapped. His smirk had vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. I saw Mr. Finch seated at a nearby table, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He gave me the slightest of nods. "Director Miller?" Henderson finally choked out, his voice a strangled whisper, all bluster gone. "But Mark is handling the Vance outreach." "Actually," I said, my voice cool and steady, "Mark wasn't aware of this particular strategy. It was a special project. One that Mr. Vance seems to appreciate requires a more direct line of communication with the person who actually, did the work." I let a small, tight smile touch my lips. The sweet, sweet satisfaction of that moment was indescribable. The coffee girl, the diligent worker from wherever, was now Director Miller, personally headhunted by the biggest potential client the firm had ever dreamed of landing. Their faces, a mixture of disbelief, dawning panic, and utter humiliation, were a picture I would treasure forever. The aftermath of that revelation was seismic. The rest of the company dinner dissolved into a blur of hushed whispers and astonished stares. Henderson, for once in his life, was speechless. He just kept opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, his eyes darting between me and Mr. Finch, who was now openly, if still subtly, smiling. Mark looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him. He avoided my gaze entirely, his usual cocksure demeanor completely deflated. The power dynamic in that room hadn't just shifted. It had been utterly and irrevocably overturned. The next morning at the office was a study in contrasts. The usual arrogant swagger of Henderson and Mark was gone. Instead, there was a palpable tension, an awkward deference whenever I was near. Henderson summoned me to his office, the first time he'd ever done so for anything other than to deliver a thinly veiled criticism or to ask me to do Mark's grunt work. He was a changed man, or at least a man desperately trying to appear changed. "Sarah, Director Miller," he began, stumbling over the new title. He even offered me a seat, the one usually reserved for important clients, not the uncomfortable one tucked in the corner. "About last night, about Julian Vance. This is quite something." He attempted a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Clearly, I've underestimated your capabilities." I just looked at him, my expression unreadable. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. Years of being undermined and dismissed weren't going to be erased by one awkward, forced apology. "Is there a point to this, Mr. Henderson?" I asked, my tone polite but firm. Yes, yes, of course, he flustered. The Vance account. It's a game changer for Sterling and Finch. And since Mr. Vance specifically requested you, well, obviously, you will be leading this. You'll have whatever resources you need. A team. A new office, perhaps? He was practically tripping over himself to appease me. I will require full autonomy on the Vance account, Mr. Henderson, I stated, not asked. No interference. My strategies, my team, my decisions. And my official title will be Director of Special Projects, effective immediately, with compensation reflecting that role and the magnitude of this new account. I'd thought about my terms. I wasn't just going to accept a pat on the head. Henderson swallowed hard. I could see the internal struggle, his ego warring with the undeniable financial windfall the Vance account represented. The money won. Of course, Director Miller, absolutely. Consider it done. Mark tried to approach me later that day, his face a mask of false sincerity. Sarah, hey, wow, that Vance thing. Incredible. Look, about everything. I guess I might have been a bit of a jerk sometimes. You know, office pressure, things get said. He trailed off, hoping for an easy absolution. I cut him off. Mark, let's be clear. You didn't just say things. You actively took credit for my work. You undermined me, and you consistently treated me with disrespect. An apology now, when my value has been so publicly validated by someone whose opinion you clearly respect more than mine, rings hollow. I didn't raise my voice, but there was ice in my tone. From now on, our interactions will be strictly professional. And if any of my work ever again appears under your name, or if I sense even a hint of the old behavior, Mr. Vance will be the first to know how Sterling and Finch really operates. Am I understood? Mark's face paled. He nodded dumbly, mumbled a yes, and scurried away. He never bothered me again. The fear of Julian Vance's disapproval was a far more effective deterrent than any HR complaint I could have ever filed in that toxic environment. The changes were swift. I got the corner office, the one with the view. I handpicked my own team, promoting other talented individuals, particularly women, who I knew had been similarly overlooked. The atmosphere in the company began to shift, albeit slowly. My success with the Vance account, which quickly became the firm's most profitable, was undeniable. Henderson, though clearly still chafing under the new order, had no choice but to publicly acknowledge my contributions. He even started, awkwardly at first, to solicit my opinion in board meetings, though I knew it was more for show, to impress Mr. Finch, who now made a point of attending meetings where my projects were discussed. Mr. Finch himself, true to form, never said, "I told you so." But the quiet pride in his eyes when he congratulated me was more meaningful than any public accolade. He had seen my potential when no one else had, and he had, in his own subtle way, helped pave the path for my vindication. I established new boundaries, not just with Henderson and Mark, but with everyone. The honey and sweetie stopped. I was no longer asked to make coffee or take notes if a junior male colleague was present. My voice was heard in meetings, not because I was louder, but because I now commanded respect, backed by irrefutable results. The power had indeed shifted, and I was determined to wield it not for revenge, but for genuine change, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what I went through. The satisfaction wasn't just in their humiliation, but in the creation of a space where competence, regardless of gender or who your friends were, truly mattered. Looking back on that company dinner, it's funny how a moment of profound public humiliation can become the catalyst for such a dramatic, life-altering triumph. For years, I had internalized their dismissals, their casual cruelty. I had allowed their perception of me to chip away at my own self-worth. I thought that by keeping my head down and working hard, my value would eventually shine through. But what I learned is that in environments like Sterling and Finch under Henderson, quiet competence is often mistaken for weakness, or worse, deliberately ignored if it doesn't fit the established narrative of who is supposed to succeed. My journey wasn't just about getting revenge on Henderson and Mark, though I won't lie. There was a deep, satisfying justice in seeing their arrogant facades crumble. More than that, it was about reclaiming my own power, about understanding that my worth wasn't determined by their limited, biased viewpoints. It was defined by my skills, my intellect, my perseverance, and ultimately, by the irrefutable results I could deliver. Julian Vance didn't care about my gender, my office location, or whether I was part of the old boys club. He cared about intelligence, innovation, and results, things I had in abundance, things they had tried so hard to bury. The real victory wasn't just the new title or the corner office. It was the shift within me. It was finding my voice, learning to set boundaries, and refusing to be small so that others could feel big. It was the realization that true empowerment doesn't come from external validation alone, though that can certainly be a catalyst, as it was for me. It comes from an unshakable belief in your own capabilities, even when the world around you is trying to tell you otherwise. It's about playing the long game, building your foundation in silence if necessary, and then choosing your moment to reveal your strength, not with aggression, but with undeniable competence. Mr. Finch's quiet belief in me was a crucial anchor during those difficult years. He taught me that substance eventually outweighs noise, and that integrity, though often less flashy, is a more enduring currency than bluster and stolen credit. His mentorship, however subtle, showed me that allies can appear in the most unexpected places, and that true leadership recognizes and nurtures talent, regardless of who holds it. The changes at Sterling and Finch weren't instantaneous or universal, but that night and the subsequent success of the Vance account sent ripples through the corporate culture. It showed that the old ways weren't the only ways, and that underestimating someone based on prejudice or favoritism could come at a very high cost. I made it my mission to use my new influence to champion others who were talented but overlooked, to try and create a more equitable environment where hard work and genuine skill were the primary metrics for advancement. What would you have done in my place, faced with that kind of public humiliation and years of being undervalued? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss the next story of a dramatic turnaround. My story is just one of many, and I believe that by sharing our experiences, the struggles and the triumphs, we empower each other. We learn that we are not alone in facing these challenges, and that resilience, strategy, and a belief in one's own worth can indeed lead to extraordinary vindication. Don't ever let anyone tell you you're nothing. Your value is inherent, and sometimes it just takes the right moment, the right opportunity, or even the right unexpected phone call for the world to finally see it too.